I'm going to start, Vicki, if you're ready. Good morning, good afternoon, whatever it is now. Thank you for coming again. And I just want to give a few details before we start, so we'll be here just shortly. And first of all, if you've been here in the past, you know that we've done the Lakeland tour in two different parts because it's far too long to do in one day. So if you were here last year, we were at the other end of the valley and we did downtown Lakeland and whatever was down there. So this year we're doing this end, which entails the Stave mill and the chemical plant and the CCC camp. So that's what we'll be looking at this year. If you were on this particular tour the last time, which I think the last time was 2013 if I recall, we did go into the woods when we got to the CCC camp. Last week I was up here and was in the woods walking where we were going to walk, and when I came out I had 12 ticks on my clothes. So as a result, we're not going to walk into the woods. We're going to stay on the road when we get there, and but everything I mentioned you can see from the road pretty much anyway, which you're welcome to look further when on your own time when you get there, but I did adjust the walk a little bit because of that. I hate to drag everyone through a tick-infested woods and then, you know.
We'll clean them all out then.
Yes, right. So that's that. And also I want to thank the Rosenbergers here who own this property. And I've always thanked the Hugos. It's still the Hugos. She's but so it's a little change since the last time. It's been a few years since we've been here. So we appreciate the opportunity to be able to park here and start here. So we're also have today a video camera going on, which we've never done in 12 or 13 years of doing this. So Vicki VanNoy here is going to be videotaping the tour, and hopefully we come up with something decent at the end. Our idea maybe is to make videos out of these that could be available. So we're trying it out this year and see how it works. So our first stop is going to be up on the road here a little ways, and then we're going to work our way back down around here and then down the road a little bit. So we're going to head off to our first stop. All right. First of all, you have a handout with you, so there's a map. I will try to remember to mention something about where we are on the map as we walk along so you can remember where we were at. If you look at your map, on the top of the map is what's called Susquehanna Avenue, running along the top there, and several houses along it. Last year we left off on Susquehanna Avenue where it says school. It has Methodist Church beside it, then Baptist Church. And we were quite a ways down the valley, down around the curve there where we left off last year. We usually don't walk that part in between because there's really not much to look at other than to talk about what was there, and so that is what I'm going to do. But the place that we're located on the map right now is if you follow Susquehanna Avenue all the way over to the left, there's kind of an intersection with what's called Palmer Street, which is right there, and right above the Stave mill area. So we're right at the intersection of Susquehanna Avenue and Palmer Street on your map. So down along this street, which was Susquehanna Avenue, down on the curve down there was a street that intersected Susquehanna Avenue and then went down over the hill into the middle of the valley, and that was called Pond Street, which you should be able to see on your map. And that led down to the Sawmill Log Pond, and it also passed the Pennsylvania Hub and Veneer Company. And that's one place where we don't go to look because there's really nothing to see about what's left of the Hub and Veneer plant. But it was down at the end of that street, and usually there's not a lot of pictures of the Hub and Veneer plant to be found because it was hidden behind the Stave mill sheds that were out here. And so photographers in town or visiting usually didn't even see it out there, and so they didn't take a picture of it. So it's hard to find pictures. If you do find pictures, it's normally in the whole overall town view of Lakeland. You'll see it right in the middle of town. But otherwise, a few details about it. It was built in 1904 and closed in 1913. It was owned by the Barclays and the Quins. If you remember last year, if you're on the tour, the Barclays, Watson Barclay and Matt Quinn are the ones that were partners 50-50 to make this lumbering operation happen and build this town. And so one of the industries they also owned, besides the sawmill and the chemical plant, was the hub and veneer plant down in the middle of the valley. So their letterhead indicated that they produce black birch hubs, veneers, and wood chips for the beer brewing industry. They had a contract with International Harvester for wagon wheel hubs, but because they didn't properly dry the wood, the wagon wheel hubs would crack, and so they really were worthless. They didn't make any money off from that. They also had a contract for Brewer's Beach chips, which were about 1/16 of an inch thick, and they would ship those to Anheuser-Busch in St. Louis for use in their vats for brewing beer. The chips were used to improve beer aging without adding flavor. Beach chips were low in resin that could impart a woody flavor to the beer, and by creating a layer of thin wood chips at the bottom of the fermenter, it provides a large surface for the yeast to settle and act on the beer. So in other words, the wood chips were probably the most valuable product that the hub and veneer plant made at that time. So next to Pond Street on the upper side of Susquehanna Avenue, go down to that curve on the left side of the road, was the Stave Mill boarding house, which this is a picture of. This was on the upper side of the road, and this was intended for young men, probably who didn't have a family. They would stay in this boarding house here. And then between that curve down there where the boarding house was and where we're located was what was called Stave Mill Row. And on the upper side of the road were 10 houses that families typically who were more permanent employees of the Stave Mill would live. If they had room in their houses, they would rent out room to perhaps single guys as well if they couldn't find room in the boarding house. Stave Mill Row have a few pictures of that. They were all identical houses along the upper side of the bank here, and there's several cabins down along here now that either sit on or sit near where some of these houses were located. Of course, at the end of Lakeland, all these were torn down and sold off and disappeared. And this is also another picture. This is Palmer Street, which is just a dirt trail basically running right through here. And Palmer Street ran right down through and ran behind the Stave Mill, where we'll be later, and it continued on behind the Stave Mill and went across a separate bridge that went over the Schrader Creek. We'll talk about Palmer Street a little bit more in a little bit. Next, after the Stave Mill Row was up on the hill here, was the Stave Mill Superintendent's house. And there's a picture here. A 1905 description says that the Superintendent E.F. Overton came to Lakeland from Detroit, Michigan. His residence is unique among modern-day dwellings in being a typical log cabin. It is entirely built of logs with bare rafters in the rooms, old-fashioned fireplaces, and all the accompaniments of pioneer days, coupled with the present-day comforts of steam heat and electricity. And then Mr. Overton also had a clubhouse nearby that looked like this. And Mrs. H.G. Hunsinger of Sayre wrote, "I visited Lakeland in 1905. There was a clubhouse a short distance away from the house, connected with a boardwalk. In a ravine between the log houses was an enclosure over a pool of water where they kept 2 bear cubs who were quite playful." So Mr. Overton had pets who were some bear cubs that he kept chained to a tree up here. And so there's pictures of them that you'll occasionally run across, entertaining for people climbing trees. Here's another one. So that was all right up here on the hillside. So the road we drove in on, which is right here, this was a road built by the Civilian Conservation Corps later on. So when Lakeland was in existence, that road was not there. In order to get to Sunfish Pond, you had to take a road at the other end of town, straight up over the hill to Carbon Run, and then go from Carbon Run over if you happen to be wanting to take a picnic up there, which some Lakeland residents did that. So at that time, this road didn't exist. And here's a picture taken from back there, looking back in our direction, which you can see Palmer Street and Susquehanna Avenue. You can see there's no street running that direction. So in order for Mr. Overton to get to his cabin, he took the roadway up the hillside here instead. As also the Pennsylvania and New York Railroad ran through the valley here, and so part of the road we drove on and we walked on to get to this point, which is down here on the other side of this curve. The railroad ran straight through the valley here, so if you were on a passenger train coming in this end of the valley, the passenger train would be going right through this area right here, and right along where the Stave Mill drying sheds were behind me, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And so Palmer Street ran right down, ran over the tracks, and then ran on to the Stave Mill right there. So that kind of gives you an idea of what was at that location. I think I have a few more pictures. This is one picture standing about where we are now and looking down toward the Stave Mill shed, Stave Mill Company. And this curve that's in the road right here is pretty much where this curve right now is. And you can see the railroad tracks they mentioned running through the middle, and then also the plant in behind there. So we'll be talking about the Stave Mill shed during a couple of different stops because there's lots to say about it. But another picture taken from, I would say, up on the hill looking back, was looking down at this part of the valley right here where the drying sheds were for the Stave Mill. And we'll be talking about what those were for in a little bit, but I show you these pictures now because we're standing about in the area that some of these pictures were taken. It's a lot easier to understand what you're looking at when you're here. Okay. So we're going to move on back down to the cabin area there, and we're going to move to the next stop. Okay. Are we ready? All right. So the last time we were here, I think, was 2013, and there was a series that was on the History Channel at that time called The Men Who Built America, which I was fascinated with. Maybe you saw it. We talked about Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Ford, and Morgan, and how they made their wealth and, did what they did to build the country. And it was fascinating because it sort of fits in with how this sugar industry that built this Stave Mill was developed. And so just a little detail from that. John D. Rockefeller was the founder of Standard Oil Company, which dominated the oil industry and formed the first business trust in the United States. If you remember the definition of a trust from your American history class in high school, definition from Webster's dictionary says a combination of firms or corporations formed by a legal agreement, especially one that reduces or threatens to reduce competition, which all those men were involved in one way or another. So Standard Oil fit that definition, became a monopoly, and eliminated its competition until it gained almost complete control of the oil market, and this made Rockefeller the first private individual in the United States to become a billionaire. There were many trusts in America, not just the ones mentioned in that particular series, that followed much the same pattern as the Standard Oil Company, and one of them is the Sugar Trust. And as the unknown source wrote in the newspapers, that the American Sugar Refining Company was especially successful in stifling competition, for it quickly gained control of most of the sugar refined in the United States. So when we talk about the American Sugar Refining Company, we have to talk about this gentleman named Henry Havemeyer, or Havemeyer, or however you want to say it. I'll say Havemeyer. And he was particularly well known because he formed the Sugar Trust in the United States. And Henry Osborne Havemeyer had grown up in the family business of sugar refining. In 1891, he was made president of the American Sugar Refining Company, serving until his sudden death in 1907. And during this time, the company controlled as much as 98% of the sugar refined in the nation, and his name became synonymous with the industry. Havmeyer was to the sugar industry what Rockefeller was to the oil industry. And this was to continue until 1922, when the federal government forced them to refrain from unfair business practices and allow for competition. And this competition, along with the Great Depression and new technology, weakened the company. So Henry became wealthy, much like Rockefeller did, and he made impulsive buys for his own purposes, and had numerous purchases of art, which he began collecting carved ivory figures and Japanese lacquered boxes and silk and so on. He was fascinated by that stuff. He then divorced his first wife and then married her niece in 1883. And by the way, the Havmeyer family, if you go Google their name, it's fascinating to read, a lot more than what we can talk about on this tour. But a lot of them committed suicide and had tragic ends, and divorced each other and remarried each other, and all sorts of weird things went on with this family. And perhaps because of this money, the money problem that they had, I don't know, but that's an interesting read for you sometime on the internet. The American Sugar Refining, he divorced his first wife in 1883. The two of them continued to collect European art, especially Degas and Monet, and after their death, their collection was given to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The curators came to inventory the collection, and when finished, had a list of just under 2,000 pieces of art packed into their 3-story home. The American Sugar Refining Company owned factories representing all levels of the sugar industry, including shipping, and one of their subsidiaries was the Brooklyn Cooperage Company, which made the barrels that were used to transport the sugar. So stave mills, such as the one that we're now at, were the companies that would make the wooden parts in order to build the wooden barrels with. So the staves would be made here and shipped to the Brooklyn Cooperage Company, and they would put the barrels together. So they're only making the parts here in Lakeland in order to make those barrels with. So according to the minutes of the Executive Committee of the American Sugar Refining Company, there were already 3 stave mills under construction in Pennsylvania when it was decided in 1899 during a meeting on Wall Street that the Pennsylvania stave plants should be held in the name of a separate corporation. And so the Pennsylvania Stave Company was formed, and that's the name of the stave company that we're at here in Lakeland. It was formed by this guy named Lowell Palmer, after whom Palmer Street is named. This is a fuzzy picture of him, but it's the only one I've ever found of Mr. Palmer out there. And he was served as his first president, and also among the first 5 board members of the Pennsylvania Stave Company was Henry Havmeyer that we talked about. So notice that this is one of the companies that the Barclays and Quinns had nothing to do with. This was just a separate company that came in and was not connected to what was going on in the rest of town. So we are at the Pennsylvania Stave Company's Lakeland plant, and this is a closer up picture showing the layout of the plant, and we're kind of approximately in the middle of this picture in as far as where the layout of the stave mill is. So we'll be talking a little bit about what different parts of the plant were used for over a few different stops, but that gives you an overview. And so there's concrete foundations here, which I think are the area where the logs were brought into the mill and began to be cut into the parts that were needed, which I'll describe in a little bit, but just to give you an idea. The sawmill down at the other end of town has really heavy concrete foundations where a lot of the really heavy steam engines and things sat inside the mill. And so you can see that the stave mill was a lot bigger than what we see with this piece, and there were other footers and things around here that are not here now. But I think the heavy machinery sat where these pieces you see still sitting here are located. So the newspaper said in 1905 that Lakeland has the distinction of being the site of the largest slack barrel cooperage plant in the world. By slack barrel in trade parlance is meant barrels for use of all substances not liquid. The plant was established in the fall of 1903 and is now conducted by the Pennsylvania Stave Company, a branch of the Brooklyn Cooperage Company, which is a constituent part of the Sugar Trust to whose use all the barrel stock is devoted. The Lakeland Cooperage Works has a daily output of 150,000 staves and 7,000 barrel heads, and has 150 men upon its payroll. There are 1 1/2 miles of piling sheds under granite roofing with water barrels along the top every 50 feet. Connected with the plant is a waterworks system with 2 Worthington pumps of the capacity of 2,000 gallons per minute. The water mains are 10 and 12 inches in diameter. The lighting is by electricity. It has for use the hardwood output of 60,000 acres of land. So there's another picture here of the Stave plant, taken kind of up where we were standing at the last stop. So you can see the drying sheds for the staves, which would be down there on the other side of this row of trees. Several sheds right there. The office for the stave mill would have been up in this area, up here in the lawn. And then the main factory back in this area where we are now. This also shows the plant. The ground level we were talking about on the way over here has changed a little bit over the years, but obviously it was built up quite a ways and over the years has been leveled out. But you can see a little bit better of the different parts of the mill that we'll talk about in a minute. So we need to understand what product was being created here. So I mentioned slack barrel cooperage. So there was 2 different kinds of barrels that they were making back then. The first was called tight cooperage, which was liquid tight, and they would ship things like liquid items and also meat in there, so you didn't want it leaking out all over the place. And here's a pile that shows the staves, which are the long parts, which make up the side of the barrel, and then the barrel heads, which are the end of the barrel, all piled there after having been created. There's also slack cooperage, which was not liquid tight and was used for things like nail kegs. You could ship cement, and you could also ship sugar, which was what was being shipped by this company. So we're going to move over to a different spot and continue talking about the stave mill. We're going to actually walk around through here, I think, so that you can get an idea of what is back here for concrete foundations. So we're standing next to the log pond for the stave mill, and there's some pictures here first before I get going. A couple pictures of the log pond to show you what this looked like. So the log pond that we're looking at, this deep gully behind me, it starts way down there, circles around, and comes up behind the mill up here. So that's what we're standing next to. Obviously, it's not full of water now, but back then, this is the log pond that we're talking about. If it was like the one down by the sawmill, at the end, they drained it, dug a hole in the side, and had.
There's a hole in the side.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about making a pond there.
Yeah. Well, that'd be cool.
Yeah.
And you could float logs in it. It'd be really realistic. Here's another picture of the log pond showing logs splashing down into the pond. So I'll mention it in a little bit exactly what was going on, but why we're looking at the pictures, basically the train was coming in along the top of the pond on that side and pulling up around here and then unloading the logs off into the pond. And it was very much the same as the sawmill down at the other end of town where we looked at that log pond, where the tracks were somewhat unlevel. They kind of leaned toward the pond so that by gravity the logs could roll off from the train and fall into the pond without really much effort, except someone had to crawl in there and pull out the slat that was holding the log onto the car. So that was a dangerous job there. So all along here, the train would be pulling up and unloading these logs so they would be splashing down right into the pond right behind us. This is another one showing the pond full of logs, which is what, when the mill was operating, that's what it was going to look like. The logs were going to be floated toward the mill so that it would be taken up into the mill using a jack slip. I'll mention that in a minute. Make sure I get the right. And this is standing on the end of the pond and looking back toward the mill, showing what would have been right out here, which was called a jack slip, and that was chains with hooks on it that ran, and the operation ran by steam, and the hooks would grab onto a log that was floating into the pond as men were pushing the logs toward the mill, and jerk the log right up into the mill so that they could do the work on it, which was just like the sawmill at the time. It was something that was rather new technology for them. They didn't have to physically pick the log up and move it into the mill anymore. They were floating it toward the mill. And it also was washing dirt and things off the logs as it was working its way across the pond. I think there's one more. We're blessed with the fact that photographers took so many pictures of this town that you can understand from all angles what was going on. So this is looking at it from the other angle, and the logs going up into the mill again. So 20 cars of logs would be dumped into the log pond each day. The Stave mill was a major user of hardwood, especially beech, birch, and maple. And inside the mill, at its height, the mill would saw 25,000 feet of lumber daily in order to make the staves and the barrel ends. And in the mill, a 7-foot drop saw with inserted teeth made by Diston would be used to cut the logs to length. In this picture you can see in Thomas Tabor's book, Ghost Lumber Towns of Central Pennsylvania, with the guy standing in front of the saw blade, which always fascinated me when I was a kid to see that picture. That was the saw blade that was inside the mill to cut these logs to length before they went on through to make the staves. The logs were rolled to what was called the bolting machine that cut the short logs into quarters. The heads of the barrels were also cut into 18 inches by 5/8 inches thick pieces. And I have another picture showing, I think, is the bolting machines. That's also in Thomas Tabor's book. The cut and quartered timber then went through a tunnel, was cooked in live steam for 8 hours. And that was, I think, out here, approximately where the pavilion is out there. And the hardwood was then cut into staves and headings after that, and then loaded onto carts. So it was a dangerous job working in the stave mill. It was dangerous working in all of the plants, but especially in the stave mill, because here they hired a lot of immigrants from other countries who came direct to Ellis Island and were looking for jobs and would be sent from Ellis Island to here on rail cars with a tag on their clothes that said Laquin. So if they couldn't speak English, they would at least get to the right place. And that was what the stave mill used a lot of, were immigrants to work in the mill who obviously didn't know English, and so it was probably difficult to understand the job that they had to do, and therefore a lot of accidents would occur as a result of that. So the newspaper said in 1904 about a death that occurred here. It says, Mark Northrup of Weston Station, an employee of the Pennsylvania Stave and Heading Company at Lakeland, was killed Wednesday morning while in the performance of his duties in the big mill. Northrup had taken the place of an oiler who was off duty. At 10:25, his mangled and lifeless body was found in the basement of the mill. His watch had stopped at 7:05, which is taken as an indication that the accident happened at that time. How long he had been whirled about the shaft on which it is supposed his clothing caught is not known. So next were the drying kilns or the drying sheds after they had gotten everything cut into what they were looking for. So they would move barrel heads out into drying sheds that were right out here, right on the edge of the pond. I think I got a picture of it. Now, first of all, this is I talked about the tunnel that they would go through and cook in live steam, first of all, to dry them out before they were sawed up. And that was right here, which is, I think, right out where that pavilion is. It's my interpretation. But the sheds that the barrel heads were dried in are pictured right here along the Stave Mill Pond, which I think they're sticking out basically right along the pond right here. This is a little bit better picture because you can see the barrel heads inside there drying. So at the Stave Mill, just like the kindling wood plant, when they're drying out wood, there was apt to be a lot more fires that would break out in these two particular mills than the others because it was very hot temperatures. And so the Stave Mill would have some fires. So in 1906, this was the newspaper's description of a fire that occurred here at the Stave Mill. And first of all, here's a picture of one of the Stave Mill drying sheds out there that burned. And that's usually where it took place, is the wood would catch on fire there, being stored, trying to cool it down and being stored and drying out under those sheds. So it said, fire which broke out in the stave sheds of the Pennsylvania Stave and Heading Factory at Lakeland early last evening destroyed about 150 feet of the shed located on the south side of the company's tract. Because of the high wind blowing when the fire began, it threatened at about 8 o'clock to destroy a large part of the company's property, and help was telephoned for to Towanda. Members of the Franklin Steamer Company and the Linta Hose Company responded, and in a few minutes had their heavy apparatus loaded on a special train at the foot of Park Street. Meanwhile, through the heroic efforts of the men at Lakeland, the fire was put under control. The long shed was cut in two and one end entirely torn down. The staves were removed and the fire deprived of anything to feed upon. After the train had started from here, it was flagged at the local SNNY station and the steamer returned to the rooms in Towanda. The following telegram was sent from Lakeland last evening to the Chief of Police, Burgess, and firemen of Towanda. Fire fully under control. We desire to express our thanks and appreciation for the prompt manner in which you got ready to comply with our request for assistance. We are willing to pay any expense incurred. W.L. Barkley, General Superintendent. E.F. Overton, Lake Superintendent. August 1918, another fire. More than 3 million barrel staves valued at thousands of dollars were destroyed in a fire in 3 of the huge storage sheds of the Pennsylvania Stave Company at Lakeland early yesterday. The cause of the blaze is unknown. The fire was discovered in the end of the sheds at 4 o'clock yesterday morning, and within a short time the alarm had been sounded, and many of the men in that section were aiding in combating the blaze. Sometime later, the Towanda Fire Department was notified of the blaze, and the siren in Towanda called local firemen to assist. The local firefighting apparatus was taken to the scene of the blaze aboard a special train, but when the men arrived at the fire, it was reported under control. Superintendent Taylor was unable to give the exact figure of the loss yesterday, but it is believed that it will total several $1,000s. When the flames were discovered, they were burning in the ends of the 3 of the sheds. All of the 6 sheds were located near the Susquehanna and New York Railroad tracks, but the sheds which burned are 300 yards distant and are separate from the road by 3 other sheds. A large number of the staves had been piled in the sheds during the past several years, and the total destroyed represented only a small portion of the total amount stored. While the cause of the blaze is undetermined as yet, it is believed that a spark from a passing engine or from the Stave Mill stack was responsible. Residents of that section scout the idea that the building was set afire. So, as we talked about at last year's tour, down at the other end, there next to the log pond for the lumber mill. They had a firefighting, a water hydrant system that ran underneath the town, and it extended up here to the Stave mill so that they could actually fight fire right here in town using that. And it's interesting, if you look on Google Earth of this valley, you can actually see the line of where the pipe still apparently runs underground from down there to up here, and you can faintly see where it's settled over the years and see that line that runs and then turns and goes toward the mill. So it's pretty neat. But they had to have their own firefighting because, as you can see by these articles, it would take Towanda a long time to load up all of their hand-drawn apparatus onto a rail car and then take the railroad up here and then unload it and then try to put a fire out after all of that time. So there's an interesting detail about the history of the town. So when the Staves emerged from the drying kilns, they were ready for what was called the jointer. There's a few pictures of the jointer. And this was a machine that was almost sitting outside pretty much down by the drying sheds. And it had a blade on it that would cut the staves into the shape that they needed to be to make them into a barrel. So the jointer was where the edges of the stave were planed to the bevel and shape needed to form the barrel when machined. The man would press a pedal to cut the joint, and there was about 25 jointing machines that were used to do all of this work. The jointers worked as a two-person team, with one running the jointing machine and the other packing them into bundles and stacking them onto cars. They worked 2 hours at a time, then 2 hours off, and many of them were missing fingers. I wonder why. There's a big blade. So there's a picture of the two guys working together. One of them's cutting the staves, and one of them is stacking them. They were paid by the piece or by the bundle, and the rest of the workers in the stave mill usually were paid a daily wage. So the guys out in the yard were paid a little bit differently than everyone else. And sometimes you even had very, very, very young men, maybe even high school age, who were working out there doing the cutting of the staves out there. So we have a few more pictures that show very young men doing it, but this is one example of that. And the plant closed in 1919 after the hardwood was all cut, and it was no longer economical to haul hardwood in from a distant area. The equipment was transferred to Georgetown, South Carolina, and then the mill was shut down. There is a picture also that is in Tabor's Ghost Lumber Towns of central Pennsylvania, which shows what the ruins of this mill looked like in 1965. So if you compare this with what they look like now, this picture is taken probably out where these trees are, looking back at this concrete piece. And you can see how much the concrete has deteriorated over the years just since the 60s. And eventually, I'm sure, will be totally gone altogether. Nevertheless, it's been here a good 100 years. So we are going to move just across the lawn a little bit and continue a little bit talking about the people who worked here. So we're going to talk about the people that worked at the stave mill now. And first of all, we're next to some interesting Mayan ruins here, or whatever you want to call them, left over from the stave mill and some of the buildings that were here. And this is about in the area that steam tunnel was that parts were going through. So that's my guess of what this piece right here is. But the people that worked in the mill, a lot of them I mentioned were immigrants. This is a picture of some of the people that worked here at one particular time. The stave mill was the largest employer in Lakeland, and most of the workers were Italian, Slavic, or Polish. They would be sent directly to Lakeland, as I mentioned, from Ellis Island. Most employees didn't speak English, and most of them quit. When they needed help, they would notify the American Sugar Company headquarters, and immigrants would arrive on the train in a few days. And their living conditions were usually pretty bad for the people that worked at the Stave mill. A lot of them lived down along the Schrader Creek, which you can see running down behind the log pond down there. And they lived right on the edge of the creek. This was taken after a flood. That's how close they lived to the creek. And they lived in an area of town called the Jungle, which was mostly where people lived who did not speak English. They kind of lived by themselves, a little bit segregated down there. And their houses were not as nice as the others in town. They were mostly shacks that were down there. And they baked outdoors. They got their water from a spring, and they took their baths in the Schrader Creek. Remember that the permanent employees also lived up here in the double houses that we talked about up along Susquehanna Avenue, but that didn't include the immigrants. The people that lived up here were more local people, maybe especially people that spoke English, and they lived in a little bit nicer place than the rest of them. An example of the immigrants' experience in coming to Lakeland is that of Tony Tama, who stepped off a ship onto Ellis Island on April 14, 1921. He was an Italian and unable to speak a word of English. He was 24 years old. He came from a small town 100 miles from Naples, where he went to school in the mornings and apprenticed as a shoemaker in the afternoons. He served 49 months in the Italian army and then came to America to be with his sister. He said, "When I arrived in the United States, the first thing they did was take us to see the Statue of Liberty. Then we went to the Office of Documents. From there, we were escorted to the railroad station. I had a railroad ticket pinned to the lapel of my coat, and he was on a train en route for Milton, but when he arrived, he discovered his sister had moved to Lakeland. So 2 days later, he was at work on the railroad for the Central Pennsylvania Lumber Company. He wound up here at Lakeland." There's another picture here of during this particular flood, which happened early on in the history of the town, showing their houses down along the Schrader Creek here and kind of overwhelmed by water. So I'd like to insert in this part of the walking tour some things that we don't get to talk about in any of the other parts of the Lakeland tour. And so first of all is firefighting in the woods, and that was something that the immigrants were involved in as well. So the Italians and the Hungarians would work on a fire patrol every half mile along the railroad tracks and every mile along the border of the lumber track in order to watch for fires, make sure that nothing was starting up. They were paid $1.49 on average for the week. Logging train crews were also trained to help with firefighting. There would be an alarm that would come from the locomotive. It would be a sound of the engine whistle too long and too short for 1 minute, which meant there was a fire in the woods and you needed to stop what you're doing and run to help. So Superintendent Barkley, here in Lakeland, Watson Barkley, had invented a cone-shaped wire mesh spark arrestor to fit over the locomotive stack. And this is his drawing of what it would look like. They were made in the machine shop, which was down at the other end of town. We were down there last year. They had a blacksmith shop and a carpenter shop and everything all in one building. And there they made these spark arrestors that would fit over top of the smokestack and keep the sparks from flying out and setting fires along the railroad. They also had an old tanker car that was used as a fire engine. This is a picture of that. It had a capacity of 4,970 gallons, rigged with a hose and a double pump. It had a capacity of reaching 350 feet from the track. So that was their firefighting engine that they created themselves. There's an interesting article I found on the internet that described this whole firefighting process that they had here in Lakeland, and it was printed about at the time that it was still in operation. And it was talking about how amazing it is that this lumber town has this whole fire apparatus set up to fight fires, because most lumber towns at the time didn't spend money on that. They didn't think that was important enough. But Watson Barclay thought that was important enough for them to do here. And so it was very unusual for a lumber town to have such an elaborate firefighting system set up out in the middle of nowhere. Another thing to talk about is crime in Lakeland. And so in a lumber boom, kind of like the gas boom that we just had not long ago, a large number of people might come to the area and there might be a little increase in crime. I'm not saying where it comes from, but nevertheless it seems to happen when there's a boom. And so Lakeland had very little crime for the most part, even with no official law or police department or anything. But what there was generally came from the immigrants that came into the area. And so the newspaper in 1905 gives an example. It says, for the last year it is alleged that one Samuel Moretta, an Italian, has conducted a pig's ear, or blind tiger, which literally means selling intoxicating liquors without a government or county license, at Greenwood, Lakeland, and Cold Springs. Complaint was made before Esquire Orcutt here, and early in March, Constable Holland went to Cold Springs after Samuel. The officer was not acquainted with the Italian and only had his description. He found a crowd of Italians at the log hotel in the woods, and upon inquiring where Samuel was told that he was in the woods. An Italian volunteered to direct the officer to where he was. When they went a quarter of a mile into the woods, the guide stopping and calling for Samuel every few rods. The snow was deep and the officer halted while the guide kept advancing. He then broke into a run when it dawned on the constable that the guide was the man wanted. He was finally captured on the Susquehanna, New York train early Wednesday morning of last week by Holland and committed to jail. Another thing was riots. July of 1905, a number of Italians were charged with riot and breach of the peace. They got mad, quit, and then they wanted their pay at once. As payday for them is July 20th, their boss refused to settle. Then the men are alleged to have become violent and waved sticks and used threatening language. In December of 1905, there was a stabbing. During a wrestling match on Christmas Day, 2 Italians were engaged in a wrestling match. While the men were struggling on the ground, a man plunged a knife into the chest of his opponent, making 2 wounds, one above and one just below the heart. The wounded man was taken to the Sayre Hospital Tuesday forenoon, very much weakened from the loss of blood and in a precarious condition. The knife wielder made his escape from the town during the night. He is described as about 25 years old, with black hair and a very heavy black mustache, and having a prominent scar upon his chin. In 1906, an Italian wielding an axe. At Lakeland last Friday afternoon, Minor Biles of South Towanda, who was employed in the factory of the Pennsylvania Stave Company, was cut on the arm by an axe in the hands of an unterrified Italian, and it required 11 stitches to close the wound. The blade entered the flesh near the shoulder and made a wound about 4 inches long. All business was suspended at the Stave mill as soon as the assault became generally known, and the man took leg ball towards Ralston, probably en route for Williamsport, where he has a brother. His name is Sam Moretta, a dangerous man with a knife who was an inmate at the Bradford County Jail a year ago last winter, doing time for running a pig's ear in the Lakeland district. Remember that? He served on the stone pile, and one day was discovered with a key that would almost unlock the manacle fastening the ball and chain to his leg. Mr. Biles was running one of the Stave machines, and Sam was a helper around the mill. Every time Biles shut down the machine, the man would start it up in his absence. Mr. Biles remonstrated with him for this, and that led to the assault. And we had illegal fishing. In 1907, 2 Italians were charged with fishing in the Little Schrader Creek on Sunday and fined $10 for each of 4 fish. A 3rd Italian dropped his fishing pole and a couple of trout and escaped over the mountain. In 1907, a shooting. Fred Seafy charged John Carfelli, an Italian, with taking 2 shots at him with a pistol. Carfelli then escaped. No reason for the shooting could be determined. A theft in 1907. Alexander Thompson, a Swede who has been employed at Lakeland, is out his pay, and Thomas Mahaffey, also of Lakeland, is in jail charged with theft. Mahaffey, while awaiting the disposition of his case, will amuse himself nursing a sore head put on him by turnkey Edbert Ward, warden at the Sheriff Griffin's jail on Pine Street in Towanda. After being placed in the Bastille Thursday afternoon, Mahaffey, who has been behind the bars on other occasions, became very abusive, yelled, and called names to everyone in hearing. Turnkey Ward does not stand for this kind of performance among the prisoners, and Mahaffey was informed that he must keep still or go to the dungeon. This made him very angry, and he started to abuse the turnkey. A few minutes later, he was piled in a heap in one corner of the dungeon, much worse for the wear and tear at the hands of the plucky prison keeper. Mr. Ward knocked the prisoner down with his fist, gave him a good slapping, and then dragged him feet first into the dungeon, where he will remain until he becomes more docile. 25 prisoners stood by and looked on while Turnkey Ward was chastising Mahaffey, and after he was through, he walked out into the corridor and said that if any of them had any idea that they too would like to run the jail, to step out while he had his hand in. There is not a more gentlemanly individual living than Mr. Ward, but when he gets mad, he is a difficult article to get around. The prisoners hold him in the highest regard, and when they saw that he meant business, none wanted to dispute with him as to who was boss of the jail. And finally, making liquor without a license in 1912. One man is dead and 2 others are not only seriously ill but have been blinded by drinking an intoxicant which the authorities believe was sold at a speakeasy conducted by foreigners at Lakeland. Frank and Tony Tedio, arrested for selling rum laced with wood alcohol obtained from the chemical plant near their home. The autopsy was done on the body of John Przinski. An interpreter from Williamsport was brought in to communicate with his wife, who strongly objected to the autopsy. The stomach, 1 kidney, a section of the liver, a section of each lung, spleen, and pancreas were taken from the dead man and sent to Philadelphia for chemical analysis. Tony and Frank will be held on the charge of selling liquor without a license, pending the receipt of the report. Information only comes out when someone is killed or there is a drunken brawl. Otherwise, everyone keeps their mouth shut. Don't you love newspaper reporting from 100 years ago? So just to mention about this property before we leave this property. After years after Lakeland ceased to exist, Fred Mount bought the Stave Mill property and built benches and tables for the Lakeland reunion. So the Lakeland reunion was held here for many years, and the Hugos bought from the Mounts. And the pavilion here is where the Lakeland reunion was held in later years and eventually died out altogether. So we're going to move on down here to the bridge and continue on. First of all, on your map, toward the left side of the map, you will find the Barclay Chemical Company and then the Stave Mill that we were currently at. In between, the Schrader Creek flows, and there is a bridge right there. So that's about, this is the area that we're at. So a little bit of explanation about this area is that the railroad, if you were on a passenger train or even a log train, would follow this railroad bed that comes up along the side of the bank here. So if it was a passenger train, the rails came through here and continued on to the left, going down the road that we just walked on, and headed past the Stave Mill and then down to the depot on the other end of town. If it was a log train that was going to the sawmill or the Stave Mill, it would go right, and the tracks went straight across and went out on top of that embankment around the log pond, and then it would continue on around that direction. So just depending on what kind of train it was, is what they would make a decision on. And so from this direction, you'd be coming from Ralston or Cold Springs or one of those, Maston. You'd be coming this direction, and then going that direction, you'd be going towards Towanda. This is a picture taken probably over here or up on the bank somewhere, showing the chemical plant on the other side of the creek, and then showing the tracks that went across here so that trains could get over there to the chemical plant and move their products out. So when Lakeland was going to be built, Watson Barkley wanted to build a chemical plant up here because he knew that there were hardwoods on the mountain, and that meant that they could produce products in a chemical plant. And the problem was that Watson Barkley didn't have any knowledge about chemical plants and how they worked. And so he had a friend, Matt Quinn, who did, and Quinn had actually produced inventions to further the whole chemical industry at that time, and in fact owned a lot of different mills all over Pennsylvania and up into New York, of not just chemical plants but other things as well. So the Quinns had a lot of knowledge on this, and so in order to have the funding needed to do this whole overall project, in order to have the knowledge that was needed to do the chemical plant, Barkley partnered with the Quinns in order to make that happen, which, as you should know, is how the name Lakeland comes about, with LA from Barkley and QUIN from Quinn. So the 50-50 partnership comes from this. So the chemical plant was an important part of the project, but the problem was, up until this point in time, there was a family living on this side of the Schrader. And by the way, we're in another township now. We're in Overton. If you didn't notice the sign when we walked up, so we walked a long way. We're in 2 different townships today. But on the other side was a family named Van Leuven that had lived up here. And they didn't own the land. They were squatters. But no one in the coal mining era had ever come this far into the mountain. So there were no roads here. And this family had found their way up in here in the middle of nowhere, developed their own home, and they had been living here all this time. And so in order to build the chemical plant that Watson Barkley wanted to build, they had to get the Van Leuvens off of the property. And so he offered Mr. Van Leuven a few things to try to entice him to take his family and leave. And so he offered the father 2 suits of woolen underwear, 2 pairs of overalls, cowhide boots, a large watch and chain, 4 quarts of whiskey, and $100 if he would leave, and Mr. Van Leuven took the deal. So with the Van Leuvens removed, the way was clear to complete the building of Lakeland by building the chemical plant. The Van Leuvens were kind of interesting people. They had a son named Sam who was a moonshiner up here on the mountain, so he could be found up around Carbon Run area sometimes with his moonshining stills. There was another daughter named Elizabeth, and they called her Lib. She was born in 1882. When she was young, she went to the doctor down in LeRoy complaining that her stomach hurt, and Dr. Bevan checked her out and discovered she had a snake in her stomach. She had swallowed it whole, and apparently thought that was going to work out for her, and it didn't. So she eventually vomited the snake, not to be too gross about it, and Dr. Bevan was so fascinated by it, he preserved it in an alcohol jar and kept it in his office. The snake was about 8 to 10 inches long. She married a man named George Preston, and they ended up living on the backside of West Franklin, and she was often known for driving a bull to the creamery at West Franklin. And there's a postcard, you might see it's out there, that shows her sitting with her, just having come from the creamery, or going to the creamery, and the bull is pulling her in that. So that picture was taken at West Franklin. So she became famous. After George Preston died, she married a man named Artie Kelly, who was a widower. He went to live with Lib, and he was known by the community as a heavy drinker. Lib and Artie would often, people remembered, call each other names out in public all the time. Kind of an interesting couple. They were going to run a hotel up here on the mountain for hunters. And so when the town of Lakeland shut down, they bought up 3 different houses here in Lakeland, tore them down, and moved them over toward LeRoy. And at the top of the mountain, there's the there's the big cabin called Jersey 3 Square at the top of, coming up from LeRoy. It looks like a gable roof, kind of looks like a barn almost. And that was built by them as their hotel for hunters. But because Artie had such a drinking problem, they were never able to open the hotel. They did get it built, and they ultimately sold the building, having not ever opened their business. So we're going to cross the bridge here. One thing to mention is that down on the other side of the creek down here was 4 houses that are often shown on the picture of lid. Sorry. With the bull pulling her. You can find that postcard on eBay once in a while, so keep an eye out. This is a picture of the 4 houses. These were chemical plant employees. This picture is taken looking right this direction. So there's 4 houses there that chemical plant people, some of them lived in. And also behind it is a large shed. That's where charcoal was kept after it was produced in the chemical plant. And we'll talk about charcoal on the other side, but it's an interesting picture because it's taken right where we're standing. So we're going to go to the other side. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the chemical plant, but to remind you of the guys that I mentioned back there who were in charge of this operation at the chemical plant. First was Watson Barclay, who was the one who lived here in Lakeland and was interested in starting this chemical plant here. And then when Watson retired and moved south, and his son Stanley took over the operation, and then he was here until the end, until the chemical plant shut down. The partner was Quinn, whose actual name is Martin Quinn, but they called him Matt, and he was the one that had all the knowledge on chemical plants and had the money to be able to help with this part of the project. So those are the guys that are involved in this part. So we've done everything we can do with wood in all of the other plants we've talked about throughout the whole valley. The only thing we haven't done is burn it up. And so that's what we're going to do in this plant. The chemical plant did a number of things, but it didn't make a necessary product out of the wood itself. It burned the wood up and made a product either with the burned wood or with chemicals that came off from burning the wood as well. So this plant, as I mentioned, we're now in Overton Township, so this part of the town went on into Overton, and this company would manufacture wood alcohol, wood acid, charcoal, and other byproducts using hardwood. During the winter, the material would be hauled and piled in the yards out back to dry, which we'll see as we walk down through here, after which it would be put through the plant after it would dry. In 1904, it was announced that C.H. Ruddy, who had the contract for the erection of the chemical plant, which they called the acid factory. Back then they often called them acid factories as well. And so this is a picture taken in 1904 of this piece of land behind us while the men are trying to establish where they would be building the chemical plant. So they had just cut the trees down, probably with immigrant labor like was done on the other end of town, and the men are actually up here in the corner surveying where the plant would be. So that's kind of a neat picture. So by 1905 the plant was ready to go. The company, as I mentioned here, converted hardwood into charcoal. Charcoal.
That's a new one.
It's a long tour, I'm sorry. Wood alcohol, or methanol, which was used as an antifreeze, solvent, and fuel as a denaturant for ethyl alcohol, and acetate acetate of lime, which was the basis of smokeless gunpowder during World War I, during which this plant was here. And that was later, they put in the equipment to be able to make acetic acid direct. So they were making acetate of lime, shipping it away to make acetic acid, and later they changed it to make it here. Acetic acid is something that gives vinegar, for instance, its sour taste and pungent smell. Something I'll mention that I had mentioned when we did this tour in the past is that this year is the 100th anniversary of World War I, and our entry into World War I as the United States. And so there's kind of differing accounts on how many soldiers actually went from Lakeland. One says 44. I've seen some lower numbers, but nevertheless, a number of young men went from Lakeland to World War I, and at least one that we know of died in World War I. So I think it's worthy of mentioning on the anniversary this year. But also, the President of the United States during World War I was Woodrow Wilson. And if you're not familiar with the story of Woodrow Wilson visiting the mountain here just before he was elected president, if you were to follow the railroad line that I mentioned down the other side of the creek here, you would go through Cold Spring, which was one of the depots on the Susquehanna-New York Railroad. And Woodrow Wilson, after he had been nominated as the Democratic nominee for president, he came up here on a fishing trip along with representatives of the Susquehanna-New York Railroad, stayed the night in a cabin down there at Cold Spring, and they went on a fishing expedition the next day. And so there's an interesting story about that. The Bradford County Historical Society has published that story in its Settler magazine in the past. And it's kind of an interesting detail about the fact that Woodrow Wilson was right here in this area just before he was elected president, and then he eventually led the United States into World War I. So he was here fishing just before he did that. So this plant was one of the big reasons that I mentioned that Watson Barclay partnered with Matt Quinn. And Quinn had been running a plant in the town of Strait in Elk County, PA. And while at Strait, Quinn had invented what was called the jumbo retort, which is basically the oven that the wood is put inside of to burn it up. It's called a retort. And there's a picture here of his design of a retort, which would have been back behind us. You can see some foundations back in the trees there. This property is posted, however, so we aren't going to walk back there, but you can see anyway the idea that there were several different retorts in this factory. And a retort, basically, this drawing shows, has a door on both ends and has tracks leading up to it on both sides. And so dried hardwood from out back here would be rolled up in these iron cars, rolled inside of the retort, which is shown here, and basically would be burned up by the extreme heat. It wasn't necessarily flames in there. It was just that it was 1,000 degrees inside the retort to make it hot enough that it would just burn the wood up instantly. And so this particular design of a retort was made by Matt Quinn. The employees in the company, there were about 65 men. Watson Barclay was very particular in who he hired, but there weren't many local people in this area that wanted to do the work entailed in the chemical plant because it was very hot, very difficult work. So they would often have to hire immigrants because no one locally wanted to do it. Most of the workers were immigrants, Italian, Slavic, and Polish people, again, worked in this mill, and there was a fairly large turnover. When help was needed, Barclay would call an employment agency in Williamsport, and immigrants would come straight from Ellis Island, or straight from the boat, they said. Pay was better here than average for the workers who would stay. If you didn't stay, obviously, which a lot of them didn't, it wouldn't matter. So the process used in this mill, this is a picture of the 5 acres of drying wood. This is a portion of it that would be out in this other end of the valley, which we'll be walking through in a little bit. And there were 5 acres of hardwood drying out in this section of the valley at all times, and they would bring it in on the railroad. They would stack it up out here would be cut to length, and it would be used to be burned up in the mill. So they would gather things like maple, beech, or oak. That was what they preferred to use in this particular mill. To move all these cars of hardwood around, there was this little locomotive that the Barclays bought. And if you're interested in seeing it today, it still exists. It's out in Corey, Pennsylvania, in a museum there where it was originally built. And if you travel out there to the local museum, it's on display. You can go on their website actually and see a picture of it too. But interestingly enough, it moved around to different places after it left here and has wound up in a museum, still on display years later. They used 100,000 cords of wood would be stacked out here in the chemical plant yard at a time, and they would be loaded into cars that would be pushed into the retorts. This is a little bit hard to see, but you can see the chemical plant, obviously in the background, and you can see there's railroad tracks with these iron cars on them that have been loaded with wood, and they're being pushed down these tracks toward the mill to be pushed into the retorts. So the basic method of operation was to heat the wood to very high temperatures in the absence of oxygen, which would release the chemicals from the wood and turn the remaining wood into charcoal. The chemicals were treated to produce the wood alcohol and the acetate of lime. The wood would be heated in the retorts for 24 hours. Again, this is another picture showing cars going toward the mill. And then the cars would be moved into airtight cooling sheds, which would last another 26 more hours. And then they were moved under a roofed shelter to cool an additional 48 hours. So it's quite a long process. This is a diagram of how this works. These are, on this left side, are the cars being pushed into the retort. The retort is next, labeled right there. It would go inside the retort and be burned up. And then it would come out of the retort into the first cooler to try to help cool the wood down so it's not going to catch on fire once they move it out into the oxygen. And then it would be moved into a second cooler, and then eventually would wind up under air-cooled sheds outside for a while until it was completely cooled down altogether. So it was a very hot process and very long process to move loads through there. This picture shows the back of the mill. I think this is in the Barclay Mountain history book, the green book, if you have that. This picture shows the doors open where they would be moving the cars into the back of the mill. And then this shows the front of the mill where they would be moved out into these cooling sheds that are out here on the other side. And here are people working in the mill with the doors open. You can see the steam pouring out of there because of the 1,000-degree temperature that it was inside. So imagine opening up that retort door and having to be the guy that moved those tracks into place just to roll the car out of there. It was probably a terrible, terrible job, but definitely one that was very, very hot and uncomfortable to do. Here's a guy getting ready to pull this car out. You can see it in there. It's just been burned up, and he's getting ready to pull that out and pull it into the cooling sheds. So it's unbelievable what those guys probably endured just trying to open up the retorts and move those cars out. And it gives you an idea why no one wanted to do that job except for immigrants. The Barclay Chemical Company at Lakeland could handle 72 cords per day. The work was miserable and difficult, and the 1,000-degree temperatures inside were produced by the burning coal brought down off the mountain from Carbon Run. And so in order to get the heat, they had to bring coal from Carbon Run down over the hill at the other end of town, load it onto the rail line, bring it up here, and that's what was used inside of the chemical plant to produce the heat here. 1906, if you did not allow the cars to cool down after they came out, they would sometimes spontaneously combust again and go into fire. So in 1906, it says that only the hardest kind of effort saved a car of charcoal which took fire at Lakeland on Friday night. The car took fire from a load being improperly cooled before being placed in the car, and the charcoal was saved only by unloading, the work being done by a fire department hastily organized from among the spectators. There was also a fire danger in the charcoal sheds along the Schrader, which was the large long sheds I pointed out in the picture back at the bridge there. After they dumped the charcoal in there, sometimes even, fires would break out inside the shed if they hadn't allowed it to cool. Another fire in Lakeland in 1906 said the charcoal sheds of the Barclay Chemical Company's works at Lakeland on the Susquehanna and New York Railroad were destroyed by fire Friday night, entailing a loss of several $1,000s. The fire was started by ignition from the hot charcoal, many tons of which are stored in the great sheds erected for the purpose. The works themselves were not damaged. The fire, following so soon after the burning of the Stave Company's storage sheds a few nights before, naturally created a great deal of excitement, though the absence of high wind prevented the fire from becoming nearly so menacing as the Stave shed fire. So with 5 acres of drying wood stacked behind the mill, a close eye also had to be kept on forest fires in the area, because if a forest fire worked its way over the mountain and got into that huge pile of drying lumber, that would ruin their supply for quite some time to be able to run through the mill. And that was another reason that Watson Barclay spent so much time in fire protection, was to protect what was going on here at the chemical plant as well. In an example of that, in 1915, the title of the newspaper article said, "Maston threatened." Fire broke out in the woods above Lakeland, presumably set by some person. Barclay Chemical Company sent 200 men into the woods to fight the fire and protect the massive amount of wood stacked at Lakeland. The chemical plant, by the very nature of what they were and the time period that they were in, produced a lot of pollution, as most chemical plants at that time did. And so it would discharge waste into the Schrader Creek, which would float down the river, and that's just the way chemical plants were 100 years ago. And so remember, however, that the immigrants living down along the creek were bathing in the creek below the chemical plant. The water runs that way, and so I'm sure that was interesting. People that lived here, some of them remembered that the water was foamy, black, and smelled funny, but no one thought anything of it. That was just how it was. The charcoal produced at Lakeland was sold to manufacturers' charcoal company of Bradford, Pennsylvania. The acetated lime was sold to the William S. Gray Company of New York City. The Woods Products Company of Buffalo bought all of the wood alcohol. After 1921, the plant stopped making acetate of lime and switched to acetic acid, making it direct here at Lakeland. And this required an expensive amount of equipment to be used in this process. And that is what the picture here shows. A lot of equipment was put in, and also a chemist had to be hired to work here in the plant in order to run this operation at this point. Here's another picture inside. It used a large amount of silver during this process, and so one of the things in the end that was important was that people came in to salvage the silver out of the factory when it was shutting down. In 1930, it was reported that the Russians had come here to Lakeland to inspect the chemical plant. It said Dr. Alexander Vavulin and Mr. S.P. Nasakin of Leningrad, Russia, inspected the Barclay Chemical Company's factory on Thursday of last week. These men, who are chemical engineers, graduates of the University of Moscow, are making a survey of the wood chemical industry in this country, especially of the acetic acid process as used by the Barclay Chemical Company at Lakeland. The survey is being made to determine the desirability of building a modern wood distillation plant in Russia. Dr. Vavulin what a weird name, could speak very little English, while Mr. Laquin could speak only broken English. However, they were fortunate in finding a stillhouse operator, Mike Felco, who understands their language and acted as their interpreter. These engineers have been in America for several weeks, inspecting the various wood chemical factories in the South and Middle West, and after their visit to Lakeland, left to inspect several northern plants before their return to Russia early this month. So the plant here closed in 1932. It was sold to the Rochester Iron and Metal Company, who began tearing it down to recover the silver, and then the company store on the other end of town also shut down on the very same day as the chemical plant. The company store, offices, depot, and the post office and 3 small garages burned to the ground June 4th, 1933. A fire destroyed then what was left of the chemical plant, and a fire that started about 3 a.m. on September 28th, 1933. It was supposed that a fire begun by a blowtorch earlier that day had smoldered unnoticed until the fire broke out. The fire was of many colors due to the various chemicals and metals that had been used in the plant. So we're going to move on to the next stop, and between here and the next stop, to your left would have been the yard where the hardwoods would be stacked very high and would be drying before being taken into the mill. So from here all the way to the end of the valley, that was what you would see to the left. Keep that in mind as we walk to the next stop. Just so I have newsletter material. Okay. So first of all, this is the area where I was covered in 12 ticks, so I would check yourself when you leave, for all of you sitting on the ground. I would check yourself before you get back into your vehicle, just FYI. And so normally we would be walking through the brush here, but we're not going to do that. So Lakeland in 1932 had ground to a halt, basically. The chemical plant shut down, and that marked the end of everything. The other plants had already shut down by that time. So when the chemical plant was done, the Barclays packed up and left, and any of the handful of residents still here left, except for the post office, which was still here and being maintained, and also a few other residents. So by the time the 1930s rolled around, the forest here on the mountain had been completely decimated by the lumber industry. The trees had been clear cut, and this had forced the wildlife to find new habitat. The creeks were polluted, and there were damage and erosion problems, and forest fires were prevalent among the brush and trees that had begun to grow in place of the original cuttings. And that's not just here. There were lumber companies all over, especially the Northeast and in Pennsylvania at the time, and that was just the way it was back then. There wasn't the kind of protection of the forest lands and so on at that time that there is now, and so when lumber companies pulled out, that's basically what was left behind in that era. So the nation had entered the Great Depression. The official unemployment rate at this point in time was 25%, and the stock market was down 90%. Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office in March 1933, and immediately his New Deal plan was put into effect. He said to Congress on March 21st, 1933, "I propose to create a civilian conservation corps to be used in simple work, not interfering with normal employment and confining itself to forestry, the prevention of soil erosion, flood control, and similar projects. I call your attention to the fact that this type of work is of definite practical value, not only to the prevention of great present financial loss, but also as a means of creating future national wealth." So FDR issued Executive Order 6101 on April 5th, 1933, which established the Civilian Conservation Corps. In 3 months, there were 250,000 men in the CCC. It was considered the fastest mobilization of men in American history. The U.S. Army was in charge of the operation, but there was no military training or uniforms for the CCC. There were 144 camps in Pennsylvania with 200 men per camp, and only 4 were on game lands, this one being one of them. 4 sites on Barkley Mountain were considered for the camp, including the town of Barkley, the town of Carbon Run, but the newspaper reported the site of the abandoned mining village to be seen of activity again for at least 6 months. So the newspaper was already reporting that the CCC camp was going to be in the mining villages, not here at Lakeland. Newspapers sometimes do that. But Lakeland had a railroad here already that had been used right up until 1932, so it was still very good condition. It had access to fresh water, had a creek down here, and so they decided to establish the Civilian Conservation Corps camp here at Lakeland instead. And so this area that we're standing in is where the camp was located, and that's what we'll be talking about the rest of the tour. A person that had come here with the first group who arrived here, his memories of that are as follows. He said, "We traveled all night by train, and shortly before noon of June 5th, 1933, we arrived at Lakeland. We were met at the railroad station by Captain Harlan F. Seeley, 12th Infantry, USA, who had preceded us to the work camp in his automobile. Captain Seeley was the first commanding officer at Camp S-103. It was raining steadily, but we shouldered our barrack bags, and with smiles on our lips, we walked to a place about a mile from the station and proceeded to pitch camp." And that's where we are now. Here's a picture of them with tents that they were pitching when they first got here. Our campsite was a fairly flat strip of ground nestling among the hills. It had been used as a lumber yard, and several railroad switches were scattered all over the area. High grass, weeds, brush, and rotting timbers had to be cleaned up before we could pitch tents. The entire area seemed to be infested with small snakes, for you sitting on the ground, but we soon dispatched with them. We had all the tents pitched before darkness set in, and they leaked like sieves. Our bedding was soaked. It was almost as wet inside the tents as it was outside in the pouring rain. Meanwhile, fires had been built, and somehow or other the supper was prepared. And soon after we had finished with our first meal in camp, we retired to our tents, hoping that the sun would shine the following day. Our hopes were in vain, as it rained almost continually during the first 3 days in camp. Our first work was clearing up the campsite. There was plenty of work to be done, tearing up railroad rails, ties, dead brush, tree stumps, and various kinds of litter and rubbish had to be cleaned up and burned. We took all of our water for cooking, bathing, and cleaning purposes from the Schrader Creek, which runs close by the campsite. We dug straddle trench latrines, set up our field kitchens, and built a temporary incinerator. Our tools consisted of a few picks and shovels, saws, hammers, hatchets, axes, scythes, and sickles. Before a week had passed, our camp had taken on a different aspect, and the entire company had become acclimated to camp life. June 6, 1933, the newspaper said 200 men of the Forest Conservation Army, with 3 officers and 7 regular Army men, established a camp at Lakeland yesterday, arriving over the SNY from Fort Washington, Maryland, about 6 o'clock in the morning. By nightfall, ground had been cleared south of the old chemical works and a tent city established. Most of the men were from small towns in the vicinity of Pittsburgh, and the majority of them were around 20 years old. They were a fine-appearing lot of young fellows, none having the appearance of being tough. The tents used are large and roomy, each accommodating 4 or 5 men. Each man has an individual iron cot with springs, mattress, blanket, and pillow. All were dressed in overalls as they scurried about, making every move count. It was the most activity seen in Lakeland in many a day. Water for drinking purposes was brought from some excellent spring nearby, and a creek near the camp furnished plenty of water for toilet and laundry. A former private garage is to be moved within a few days to the site of the post office, which burned Saturday, and a post office established in it for use while the camp is in use. So Camp S-103, which was later called Camp Lost Horizon, from 1933 to 36, it was known as Company 387. And then those men left. A new group came from 36 to 37 called Company 5464. And from 37 to 41, it was Company 1377. So the name Camp Lost Horizon was suggested by one of the enrollees in the camp, who was awarded a pack of cigarettes for having made that suggestion. Right in the woods here, through the trees, you'll see a rock sticking up. And get to the right picture here. We're kind of in the center of the CCC camp. First way you can tell that is by the line of trees planted along the road. And you'll see when we get to the next stop, a line of trees planted where the barracks buildings were. Because when CCC camps got up and left, a lot of the time, they planted trees to show where the camp had been. And so this kind of gives you an idea. We're right down the main center of the camp. The camp would have looked like this, looking in the same direction that you're looking now, and just looked like a regular military camp. There's a rock sticking up in the picture right here, and that's the rock that's sticking up out in the woods. That was kind of the center of a little landscaped area in front of the officers' quarters. The officers' quarters are back in the trees there under briars, and you really can't even see it anymore, but the foundation is still back there for it. This is another picture taken from the other side looking out, and the rock again is in the picture. And you can see the officers' quarters I mentioned right behind it, right back there. And then this building, which was used as a hospital as well as offices and other things, was right behind it, and we'll be talking about that one at the next stop. Let's see if I have one more. This is a close-up of the officers' quarters out there. Again, a rock sticking up in the middle, so thank goodness for the rock so we can tell where everything is around here. And standing about where we are these officers who were leading the camp at the time that they moved in here. That's what they looked like at the time. They were dressed fairly military looking, although the men were not dressed that way. On July 16th, 1933, the newspaper reported a ceremony was held at the camp during which a flag was presented by the Towanda American Legion to the CCC camp at Lakeland. The flag was then raised on the flagpole, which was made from a 50-foot basswood tree covered with aluminum paint. 800 people from Towanda and other areas watched. The American Legion Drum Corps played music. By the way, as I'm reading this, there's a picture of this event they're talking about. The CCC boys took on an oath of allegiance to the flag. Speeches were made. The Drum Corps made a demonstration of various drills and formations. Visitors were free to explore the camp, and then the camp routine was explained by those in charge. They had various flags that they would fly on the flagpole. The flagpole would have been right out here near the rock, and various flags meant different things. The flags flying under the American flag meant if the commanding officer is in camp, and if not, the flag representing the person is in charge. So there'd be a special flag on the pole telling you who's currently in charge. If the medical officer is in camp, or if the junior officer is in charge, there'd be a separate flag for that. There would be a flag designating the camp's rating as excellent, assuming it is, and a flag indicating that church services are being held, if they were, and a flag signifying that there was an inspector in camp. So that gives you an idea that you might want to clean up your quarters because someone's coming around to check. December 13th, 1934, the newspaper said, probably everyone in Bradford County knows that a CCC camp has injected new life into the almost abandoned lumber town of Lakeland, but that the word camp in this instance means more than a number of tents will be a surprise to many. First of all, here's a picture of the camp as they started to build buildings. Tents long since were discarded there. Wooden buildings of substantial design have taken their places, and Camp S-103 has taken on the appearance of a real village. There are streets, a recreation hall, a mess hall, 5 barracks buildings, and another building housing the officers, a hospital, tool house, garages, a playing field for use in leisure time when work is done for the day. In fact, there are 18 buildings in all, and many of the things that one would expect to find in an up-to-date town. The campers even have their own electric light plant and an ingenious refrigerator house built into the side of the hill. Later, a 6th barracks and an education building was added. So we're going to move to the next stop and continue to talk about the buildings that are here. Sprinkling, so you would know what it was like when the CCC men first came here, just in case you weren't sure. First of all, where we're located now, in this picture, there's a building right here, and that's the hospital building I mentioned, and the foundation is right under the trees here, running towards the creek that way. And on the other side of the road, there's a foundation. You can see footers right out there in the grass of a long building running that way, and that's the recreation hall. And back behind it, in the bushes back there, that's where we were first at. There's barely, you can see under the brush, a concrete foundation, and that was the mess hall. And then behind me, there were 3 barracks buildings under the trees, which is where I picked up the ticks from. But you can see them when we walk through here. You can see footers from the barracks buildings. There's one right here, one next to it, and there's a third one that unfortunately was wiped out in the 2011 flood, and the footers washed down the creek. So there were 3 there, and then there are 2 on this side, which you can still see. There's right there, you can see some footers sticking out, and then there's one next to it. So there's 5 barracks buildings that the men would have stayed in when they were here. And by the way, notice that the trees that were planted by the men outlined the row of barracks buildings where they planted the trees to signify that. You can really notice it better if you, again, get on Google Earth and look at this particular area. You'll see a straight line of trees here and a straight line of trees here marking the center of the camp, which is kind of a neat little detail. So the dispensary, or the supply and headquarters, were all in one building. That's the long building I mentioned here. All these buildings were heated with coal stoves, and so that one was as well. In the headquarters is where they kept the payroll. In the storage part of the building, they kept mess kits for new additions, new men coming into the camp. They would visit there. In the dispensary part of the building was where the doctor was. He had a few beds in there and equipment to handle any emergencies. If it was an emergency that was too much, they would take them on to Towanda. But for the most part, they could handle them here in the camp. January 1937, there was a flu epidemic here in the camp. 60 were taken ill, 8 of which were transferred to the Packer Hospital. Pneumonia was developing in a number of cases. And men from Alabama were not used to the cold northern winters at the time, and so a lot of them were getting sick in that particular epidemic. Captain Schermerhorn was a chiropractor, so you could get chiropractic needs taken care of. And people who remembered him said he would grab the boys with a headache and give their neck a quick twist and immediately cure it. Daily Review in 1933 said Dr. Charles Ferguson, a Navy lieutenant who has charge of the health of the boys in the CCC camp at Lakeland, at last has found what he's been looking for ever since he arrived. Part of the MD's duties have been to inspect springs used for water supplies, toilet arrangements, etc., and necessarily he has had to tramp around considerably in the woods. Realizing that in such places the snakes are likely to grow big, he has constantly had his eyes peeled for them, not because he wanted to make friends with any of the reptiles, but just because he would much prefer to go in the opposite direction. But he tramped around for days and never saw even a garter snake. Then, just when Doc began to feel that maybe his study of reptiles was going to be slighted, something happened. With his nose poked into a medical book, he entered his tent and sat down on the bed, still reading intently. His foot touched something round like a rope, only bigger and more slippery. Doc took one glance, and that was enough. The springs aren't much in those army cots, but what there were acted like a catapult on this occasion. In one bounce, the physician was out of his tent and clear across the company street, shouting for someone to give him a gun and do it quick. Campers came running from all directions, and excitement ran rampant. "There's a rattlesnake in my tent, and he's all ready to spring," panted the doctor. "Oh, it's just a grass snake," someone volunteered. "There hasn't been anything else around all the time we've been here." but Doc was sure. His one hasty glance had been enough for him to see the string of rattles. So all crept up on the Ferguson tent, Doc with his gun ready to crack the head from the enemy. When they got there, the snake was in position, just as Dr. Ferguson had said, and it was a big rattler too. But it never twisted a muscle or batted an eyelash, even with the crowd looking at it. Then someone started to laugh, and Doc realized what was up. The snake had been dead for hours, the campers thinking it would be a good joke to place it there because the doctor was known to have an aversion to these hated critters. So they had fun in camp. Down here in the Schrader Creek, there is a swimming hole, and it's hard to even see where it would be now because the Schrader is so washed out from flooding over the years. But the boys would go down and swim in the Schrader Creek. Starting over here, the barracks building that washed out, which was basically would be floating out in the air now. These are pictures. First of all, it showed the three on this side of the road. This is the one that is washed out, and these two. You're basically looking at the view right here, 1, 2, and 3. The barracks buildings were 120 foot long and 20 foot wide approximately. Barracks number 1, as I mentioned, was gone. If you notice right here, it's hard to see because things are growing up again, but they did landscaping in the camp to make everything look nice. And so there's kind of a concrete curb that's rounded and curves around here next to the officers, or next to the hospital building. And they planted flowers in there. And so here, all these years later, they continue to grow just randomly on their own. And they've expanded over a wider territory in the meantime. But nevertheless, you can see some of the landscaping that they've done right there. In order to join the CCC, you had to be a citizen of the United States, you had to be a male, and you had to be unemployed. The term would be 6 months, an 8-hour day, earning $1 a day or $30 per month. $25 would be sent home, and $5 you could keep to support the local economy. Men typically stayed at the camp for at least 6 months. This is a picture inside one of the barracks to show what life would be like for them living inside. This is an example of a group of men in camp at one particular point in time with the dress that they would have on as they worked up here. So the camp work schedule began at 6 a.m. in the morning. The bugler would sound reveille, or in Lakeland they used a 12mm field piece to wake you up. They would get dressed and ready for roll call, and then breakfast and morning classes were held. This is a picture of some of the classes held. The classes could include carpentry, blacksmithing, typing, plumbing, electrical, aerial photography and mapping, truck driving, etc. And so in addition to working out in the woods while you were here, you could be learning a skill while you were here in camp. Seems like it would be something that would be useful still today. Just my humble opinion. At 8 a.m., each man assigned to a group of 6 to 12 and sent out to work. Trucks would be waiting to take them then to their place of work for that particular day. So trucks would disperse, go out into the woods, and take them to their project site. So this is a picture of the men right along the street or here down the center, loading men up to get ready to go out for the day. At 11 a.m., the lunch would be brought out to the men in the field, so they would eat out where they were at, which is one reason that pavilions were first built at Sunfish Pond, because men working up at Sunfish Pond needed to eat lunch, and so they built places for the men to eat. And when the CCC was gone, those pavilions and whatever they built, picnic tables, were left, and people started using them to have their own picnics, even though it was technically not for picnic area by that time. It was game lands. And so that led to a fight between the people and the Game Commission to finally turn that piece over to the county and establish a park so people could use Sunfish Pond as a park. And so, long story for that, but that's where Sunfish Pond really started to be developed. And at 4 p.m. they would return to camp. Supper was at 5 p.m. And then they could choose athletics, attending classes, or reading. A punishment included more work in the evenings if you had done something wrong. And at 10:30 there would be lights out. So this is a picture of the men in their bunks here at Lakeland just before the lights out. The camp had a newspaper, and so you'll find a lot of information about what happened in the camp by reading those little newspapers they made. And so this is a description written by one of the guys in the newspapers of what a rookie would experience when he first arrived in camp. So it said, it is considered a privilege by the members of this organization to be in a position to act as a member of the reception committee that welcomes the rookies into our most superior company. Undoubtedly, the reader would be amused to know exactly how a rookie meets camp life for the first day. So, dear reader, prepare for several humorous experiences that these rookies have encountered in the following lines. Picture the Lakeland Limited chugging to a desperate stop at the most convenient spot for the rookies to begin their weary and tiresome trudge to the camp property. Usually, they are accompanied by a non-commissioned officer of the United States Army who chaperones them from the fort to the camp where they are to be stationed. Their eyes show puzzlement, awe, wonder, and interest. Without any formalities, the veterans gratuitously begin to chide them with taunts and ridicule, all in good nature. In other words, they are immediately given a verbal ride. All these lads are usually hungry after having to ride for hours and hours. The first issue they receive here consists of a full mess gear, commonly known as eating utensils. From the supply room, they are herded into the mess hall. So from here, they go over to the mess hall. Where they show their appreciation to a good meal by promptly doing justice to the food served to them. By this time, they feel that the boys are a fine lot after all and allow themselves to be taken into the confidence of the regular camp fellows, which is exactly what is wished for by these villains in our camp. During the afternoon, one may see two rookies climbing a hillside in search of the company cows, and others seeking horses. No such creatures exist in the surrounding woods, yet they earnestly seek whatever is requested of them. Some question the neighborhood and location of a herd of goats they have been ordered to recover. Others are given hot water, soap, and scrubbing brushes by the kitchen police, who feel it a lucky break to be given KP duty on the day these rookies are to arrive in camp. They thereby have a vacation for a few days until the rookies are sent out on the road with a regular crew. By evening, they are unable to understand just what they are to do in our camp, because they are sent in circles continuously. Some boys pose as medical men and call for a physical examination of the rookies. All the old-timers follow these docs through the barracks while they go through their act and find much fun in the advice given to the frightened rookies and the remedies meted out to them for the ailments found by the doctors. To top all this, they hear stories of frigid cold, which prevails over this territory for several months, never letting up. Multitudes of hardships are in store for them. Bears, wolves, mountain lions are numerous in these mountains, according to the tall stories unraveled by the men who know. Probably by bedtime, the rookie is questioning the thought of staying here for the period he enrolled. Their minds repeat all the hardships and gloom in store for them, and after weighing the benefits of home life with the sturdier camp environment, I'll bet they feel inclined to wring down the flag of pluck and nerve and hoist the white flag of resignation and defeat. However, by morning, the picture is brightened for them by the new friendliness shown to them. The initiation is over, and then they are full-fledged members, ready to work, play, and associate with the regulars. A new and different picture is unfolded to them, and after hearing tales of the good times in store for them in the city of Towanda, they are more than anxious to take a trip into town to see what fascinates the boys in general. Stories of beautiful girls in great numbers appeal to their imagination, and probably they all set their hearts on bringing a sigh of admiration from the pulchritude that is so evident on Saturday evenings in Towanda. So I mentioned on the other side is the rec hall, which is back through the trees right there. Pictures inside the rec hall. 1934 newspaper said in the recreation hall there are reading tables, places to play games of all sorts, pool and ping pong, and a refreshment counter. Here the boys gather for their evenings, read the hometown newspapers, listen to music, or hear a speech by someone who has been invited in for the occasion. There they are at the refreshment counter getting refreshments. Here they are playing pool inside the rec hall right here. And here they are playing ping pong. So religious services would be held weekly by an army chaplain. Occasionally special visits from local ministers were scheduled, and you could also get a ride into Towanda to attend church if you wished. There was also a camp library, which is pictured here. Books and magazines were made available along with tables and chairs. If you didn't know how to read when you arrived at camp, you would be taught. Camp newspapers, I mentioned the CCC boys at Lakeland in 1934. It was reported they were putting out a homemade newspaper. It was printed by mimeograph, and it was 10 pages long, called the Lakeland News, and it first made its appearance that year. On the weekends, the boys often went to Towanda. It was popular to go down and see a movie. The CCC truck would wait behind the theater in Towanda, and if you misbehaved, you would be brought back to the truck, and punishment would await you when you returned to camp. If you missed the truck, you had to walk or get a ride in the morning from Towanda to here. It was also popular to go to Towanda to meet the girls, and this resulted in more than one marriage. And when a rumor was started that the camp was to be disbanded, 5 men proposed to their local girlfriends right on the spot. Sometimes there were special events. In 1934, the CCC held a dance at the Towanda American Legion for the boys and invited local Towanda girls to come to the dance, which would last from 8 to 11:30 p.m. Officers of the camp promised that the date will be well chaperoned, the newspaper said, and are anxious that girls of Towanda and vicinity attend. They will be admitted free and will be assured a good, respectable time, the officers say. Music will be furnished by Harold Harris's Happy Revelers. In 1935, a group of Broadway actors and actresses came and presented a play in the recreation hall here. In 1937, 110 members of the Lions Club of Towanda visited Lakeland for a softball game, volleyball game, potato races, sack races, and other games. A chicken dinner was held at 6 with musical entertainment and boxing in the recreation hall following. A movie followed that, and an open house for Lions by the officers. In 1938, Daily Review staff was entertained in appreciation for the paper putting out a double-page spread in the newspaper a few weeks previous. A roast duck dinner, speeches, boxing, singing, and dancing were all held here at that time. On the other side of the road were barracks number 4 and 5. First of all, here's a picture of the boxing. I forgot that. It was very important in the CCC camp here. Anyway, on the other side were barracks 4 and 5, and this is a picture after the buildings had been covered with kind of a tar paper material, and so you can see all 5 of them. This picture would be taken out there looking back toward this direction and looking at all 5. A lot of these men that came here had just recently, or even perhaps at the time they came, were teenagers in their late teens or early 20s. They were still young men, and so they were fond of of jokes and pranks and so on going on here in town. This is a picture of some of these young men. Out of the newspapers for the camp, it was said, "We wonder who the busybody was who asked Mr. Bunyan why his nose was so red. It is claimed that Mr. Bunyan replied that his nose was just blushing with pride because it wasn't always being stuck into other people's business." Also from the newspaper, Jones went to Williamsport and met Dezek's girlfriend. Recently he received a letter inviting him to her birthday party. Dezek heard of it and remarked, "That's the second birthday she has had since I met her, and I've only known her for 1 month." If a boy is a lad and he has a stepfather, does that make the boy a stepladder? This is the comedy of the 1930s. All the world loves a lover, and especially if he is as dashing and charming as our Charles Gray. By the way, if you are ever in Towanda on Saturday and Sunday and get lonely, you can always find Jake on Main Street, one flight up. Judging from Jake's actions, all the world loves him too. Here's something that you fellows should know. I found out the other day that the blonde is looking for another victim. Better watch your step. While I last visited Towanda, 5 of the city's fairest confessed to me that they thought Kenny Tennyson was the most handsome boy they had ever seen, even if they couldn't understand him. Who is the certain gal from Towanda who invited one of the boys to have Sunday dinner and then made pies with his initials on them? These are the kind of jokes that would appear in the camp newspaper. Then there was a letter to one of the men's sweethearts, which was printed as follows. "The great love I have expressed for you is false, and I find that my indifference towards you increases daily. The more I see of your letters, the more I hate you. I can assure you that I never intended to love you. If we were united, I would experience nothing but hatred of my friends, added to the everlasting displeasure of living with you. I have indeed a heart to bestow, but I do not desire to imagine it at your service. I could not give it to anyone more inconsistent or capricious than yourself and be capable of doing justice to myself and family. I speak sincerely, and I hope you will do me the favor of avoiding me. You need not trouble yourself about answering this letter, as your letters are always full of impertinence and have not the shadow of wit and good sense. Believe me, I am so adverse to you that it would be impossible for me to be your loving and affectionate sweetheart." But she didn't get angry, as you might think, for he explained that she should read every other line instead of every line, which reads, "The great love I have expressed for you increases daily. The more I see of your letters, the more I love you. If we were united, I would experience nothing but pleasure of living with you. I have indeed a heart at your service. I could not give it to anyone more capable of doing justice to myself and family. I hope you will do me the favor of answering this letter, as your letters are always full of wit and good sense. Believe me to be your loving and affectionate sweetheart." Also in the Lakeland News, one guy commented, "It's not the camp I hate to leave, it's the girls in Towanda." So, out behind the barracks buildings, we normally walk out there, and we're not gonna, is the electric light plant, which there's a square foundation out there. That tells you where the electric light plant is. So they generated their own electric for the lights in the buildings around here. And a generator was added as a backup in case of mechanical failure. On the back of your map, by the way, I should have mentioned right from the start, is a map of the camp. And you'll see the different buildings I've been talking about. Building number 1 is the building right here, which was the hospital. So you can kind of get the layout of what we've been talking about. Number 2 is the officers' quarters out back. 11 through 15 are the barracks buildings. On the other side of the road, 17 is over here, which is the rec hall. Number 8 is down there, which is the mess hall. So you can see other buildings also in the picture. Number 18 is the garage, is one of the garages, I should say. Also 19 is the bathhouse. 16 is a little tiny building. That was the electric generation building. 21 is the refrigeration building, which they built into the side of a bank with stone laid up foundation. You can still see that back there. This map is, by the way, is in the Barkley Mountain History book, which has all of the explanation of what all these are. So if you have that book, you can go there and see all that. If you don't have the book, we sell it in the gift shop, so you can check that out. But there are a number of different buildings in the camp. The newspaper said during the month of September 1933, the bathhouse was constructed, and that structure was erected by members of the company. The plumbing work was accomplished by employees of the firm from whom the hot water heater and tank had been purchased. The bathhouse certainly was a most welcome addition to the camp, as the air was rapidly becoming too cold to afford comfort while bathing in the Schrader Creek. We had water buckets and wash basins in each tent. Each morning, ice was found to have formed in the top of each water bucket. We had to break in the ice before water could be poured into the basins. Yes, the bathhouse was considered a luxury. We now had hot water with which we could wash. It was a great relief after using cold water for several months. In order to assure the camp of an adequate supply of water for cooking and bathing purposes, it was decided that a reservoir would have to be built. Work soon started on that project, and before many days passed, a 10,000-gallon concrete reservoir was completed on the hillside, which should be up there, to the east of the campsite. This reservoir is fed by 4 springs located on different parts of the hillside. The reservoir is about 1,000 feet from the campsite, and its elevation is approximately 125 feet above the camp. The shower house that's pictured on your map was about 30 feet long and had no stalls, and so when they did have showers put in, everyone showered together. And also there's a laundry building, so you can take your laundry there to get that dealt with as well. The mess hall, which was back there in the trees where the previous stop we were at, here's a picture. Oh, this is them doing the laundry. So you could take it there, and you could pay to have your laundry done for you. And this was before the mess hall was built, which is what we're talking about next. They had tents set out in the middle of the camp here, and men ate at picnic tables that they had built when they first came. And that's how dinner was served here at the camp up until then. This is a picture of the mess hall back there in the trees being built. And the men did all the work building it. The Lakeland News in 1935 said, "Our first kitchen was the field kitchen erected in the open and covered by a fly tent," which is the picture I just showed you. "We sat around on stones on the ground when we ate our meals. In a few days, lumber was brought into camp and mess tables were constructed. After a few weeks, construction of the mess hall was started. It was a long, slow project, as there were few tools with which to do work. There was no skilled laborers hired, and all work was done by members of the company. When the mess hall was completed, the mess tables were carried into the building, and for the first time, food could be eaten without having to eat a large portion of our peck of dirt. For every gentle breeze wafted dust and dirt into our mess kits as we dined in the open." It said a kitchen was built in the mess hall, with brick stoves were constructed in the kitchen, and the food became more palatable than when it was cooked in the open. In the fall of the year, 3 army ranges were set up in the kitchen to replace the brick ovens. The army ranges brought about many changes of food in our mess. Dishes could now be prepared that it was impossible to have before, such as rice pudding, baked beans, cake, pie, and biscuits. And the kitchen was in an L shape on the end of the mess hall, and then of course they had access to the refrigeration building then there in the hillside behind them. The 1934 newspaper said there was a large mess hall in which all of us ate at once, the officers and the guests having a small separate room on the end. The food is of the highest quality obtainable, a glimpse in the kitchen revealing only the best known brands of canned foods. That the food is good is shown by the fact that in 6 months' time, the usual period of enlistment, the boys have shown a grand average gain in weight of from 20 to 25 pounds, despite the hours spent in hard manual labor. Gerald Firestein remembers someone caught an owl and put it in the store room to catch rats. It caught 1 rat a night for 3 nights, and after the 4th night, the owl was dead and more rats and more rats and supplies, cans, sugar, rice, and flour were scattered all over the floor. He figured that the rats had ganged up on the owl. In the newspaper also was a joke about the food, and it was a short poem that said, "The mess sergeant Barry and his cooks, they are fine. They always like to see us come to mess in a line. They cook up the grub so dainty and neat that even a corpse would get out of its coffin to eat." So we're going to move on to the last stop. Got to show you the picture inside the mess hall, all neatly set up. And I might mention later that all these buildings were torn down when the camp closed down. That was what the regulation for CCC camps were. So this is the kitchen. So it was very modern setup here for a camp that was out in the middle of the woods. Another picture of the kitchen. That's the government of the United States. That was their regulation. Everything had to be completely turned back to nature when they left again. So whether that meant burning it up or trashing it, then that's what they did. So we're going to move on to the next stop. We're at the last stop. It still hasn't gone into a full pour yet, so we're still doing good. I neglected to show you this picture at the last stop, which I can't pass up. This was taken outside of the mess hall. It says mess hall right there. And one of the CCC boys has his head on top of the post, and the other kid has a cleaver in his hand, ready to chop his neck off. So they took that funny picture there. So just a bunch of jokers. That's all they did. So we're in on your map. You'll find an area of the CCC camp called the athletic field, and that is what this area was. This is where the men could spend time doing sports in the evenings if they were interested in doing that. So there was a baseball diamond here. They had a basketball court set up, a tennis court, a volleyball court, and a badminton court. So pretty much no matter what you were interested in, they had something set up here. And also on the other side of the road, where you can see it cleared out over there, were more parts of the camp as well. There was a latrine. You can see number 22 on your map was a latrine, and number 23 was a pumping station as well, which were right out here along this road. So they're often on the sports field competition between barracks and also against other town groups. December of 1935, back to conservation again, there was a young doe rescued from the icy waters of the Schrader Creek and adopted as the mascot of the CCC camp. And they reported in 1935 that it had died, and it had died of pneumonia and died as a result of exposure. The deer had been rescued from the creek, it said, by the manager C.M. Thompson of the local Gulf Company and 3 friends from Schuylkill County who came upon the distressed animal while hunting. Ginger, as they called it, was apparently responding to treatment and was taking nourishment from a bottle when the complication developed. A funeral befitting her station was held at the camp today at sunset, and as taps sounded throughout the valley, the mascot was carried to her last resting place. And now it's raining. On the 5th anniversary of the CCC in 1938, there was a explanation given of the kind of work that had been done by the CCC here on the mountain during the time that they were here. They were here not too many years after this was published, so this gives you an overview of what they had accomplished. It said there were field plantings on game lands, and it's resulted in the planting of 214,600 trees and 15,350 shrubs. Nearly 250 acres have been covered in this work for increased game feeding. 3,500 apple trees have been pruned on the hunting grounds. 200 pounds of seeds from hardwood trees have been collected and sent to various nurseries for propagation of the species. Construction and maintenance of 38 miles of truck trails and accompanying bridges were done. These roads included the Sunfish Pond Road and onto Marsh Run, as well as the South Refuge Trail and the Thomas Run Road, which aggregate over 13 miles. the Refuge Headquarters Road, the one to the Fire Tower, the Long Valley Road, the northward to Sand Run, the Cabin Run Road, and the Camp Brule Road, and the road from Powell to Lakeland had all been improved by the camp. There was cutting of 15 miles of fire breaks to prevent the spread of forest fire. There was forest stand improvement of over 3,185 acres, wildlife cutting and feeding, food and cover planting and experimental plots comprised 26 acres, stream development for fish protection and flood control already covers 11 miles of streams, and thousands of fish have been stocked in the game land streams. Deflectors and dams are included in the stream improvement work. The Kellogg Fire Tower and the stone cabin at the base of it, which is out towards Weston. Stone house is still there if you want to hike out in the woods and see it. And also the phone line to Powell were built by the CCC. A public park is being prepared by the CCC boys from Lakeland at Sunfish Pond. A bathing beach is being fitted up near the Game Refuge Keeper's home, and fireplaces and shelters for picnickers are being built. 22 springs have been developed throughout the game lands. Directional warning and educational signs have been placed for the benefit and information of sportsmen and other visitors. A checkerboard of 15 miles of fire breaks segment the entire forest area and can be easily reached over the network of truck trails in case of a forest fire. Fire hazard reduction through roadside and other cleanup covers 40 miles. Blister rust on private land covering nearly 4,000 acres. Telephone lines were built from the camp to Lakeland onto the Game Refuge Keeper's house at Sunfish Pond and through to LeRoy, which is right here. Originally, this is what this was cut for. A topographic survey was completed. 60 miles of boundary markings. Timber estimating has been finished on 14,000 acres, and forest fire extinction and in-flood relief work was done. So, the conclusion of this story is following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, all federal programs were revised to emphasize the war effort, and so the CCC disbanded at the end of the fiscal year on June 30th, 1942, and most of the CCC boys who were already military trained by this time were put directly into service in World War II. The camp then at that time was dismantled. Army regulations dictated that everything not taken should be burned or buried. The Lakeland News, the camp newspaper, gave this description written by one of the men at the camp, and this is how I'm going to close, and this is what his thoughts are of the future of the work that they have accomplished here on the mountain. He said, when that molten ball of fire sweeps down over the western horizon on Thursday, July 8, 1937, the final chapter of the short story of Company 5464 will be at a finish, and on trains and trucks wending around mountain bends there will be members that once composed this gallant band from out of the South. Years may bring happiness or tears, yet the memories of months spent in this deep valley will waken the heart to a thrilling tempo. We have come, lived, and gone, yet markers of our work shall live on into the eons to come, and we only hope that they shall be appreciated and not abused. We give our efforts as a toast to this country and can only hope that we may live to see the result. Thank you for coming out today and experiencing this part of Lakeland. There are cookies and water back there at the start once you walk all the way back there. And there's a donation can if you wish to give a donation. We appreciate that. Thank you for coming out today.